So when you look at the 18th and 19th centuries, it wasn't just inventions changing things. It was society itself kind of collapsing.
Absolutely. The old feudal system was basically gone. Capitalism was booming. And the old ways of understanding the world, religion, tradition, they just didn't fit anymore.
Right. And you had these huge forces colliding, the Enlightenment, science, the Industrial Revolution.
And these forces, they didn't just create progress, they created huge problems. I mean, poverty on a new scale, crime in the cities, massive inequality. And the sources we looked at show that philosophers, well, they realized they couldn't just sit back. They felt they had to get involved, try to fix things.
They weren't just describing anymore, they were prescribing, trying to find theory solutions. So our mission today is to trace that journey. We start with the Enlightenment's big bet that objective truth, universal reason, that was the path forward. Then we look at the radical challenge from Marxism.
Right, a totally different approach.
Yeah. And finally, we get into the 20th century critiques that basically ask, is objective truth even possible when you're talking about human society?
We're really charting how the whole idea of knowledge and even how we think about freedom or emancipation has been completely turned on its head over a couple of centuries.
Okay, let's dive in. Starting with that age of, well, maybe optimism, the Enlightenment. Core belief, reason plus observation equals progress.
That was the dream, yeah.
But even then, there was this tension, right? The sources show two main paths to getting that knowledge. You had rationalism.
Descartes.
Yeah, Descartes. All about pure reason. I think, therefore I am. Truth starts in the mind.
Right. Abstract thought is key. But then you had the empiricists.
Bacon, Locke.
Exactly. They were saying, hold on, knowledge comes from out there, from what you see, touch, experience, direct observation.
Testing things. Methodically.
Which, leads straight to the modern scientific method. That's its foundation.
So what happens when you apply that rational approach, not just to science, but to, say, ethics? That brings us to Kant.
Kant. Yeah, he took reason very seriously for morality. But he wasn't promising a quick fix.
No easy answers there.
Definitely not. Kant's view was rigorous. He thought ethical progress wasn't like one brilliant insight. It was collective.
Something societies build over time.
Over centuries, even. Applying reason, looking at the results, educating people, slowly working out these universal rules. He called them categorical imperatives.
Okay, break that down. What are they, essentially?
They're basically ethical commands that should hold true for everyone, everywhere, no exceptions. Like his famous one, treat humanity always as an end, never just as a means.
Don't just use people.
Right. And Kant argued the ultimate point of figuring out these codes was to maximize human freedom, the greatest possible freedom for everyone.
Okay, but connecting those big philosophical ideas to the messy reality on the ground, that's where Auguste Comte comes in, with positivism.
Comte really tried to make society itself into a science, a radical step.
He wanted a kind of scientific map for history.
Yeah, with his law of three stages. First, people explain things with God's supernatural stuff. That's the theological stage. Then, stage two, the metaphysical. People start talking about abstract forces, nature, human reason itself.
Getting closer.
And finally, stage three, positivism. This is where you ditch all the speculation, religious, philosophical, and focus only on what you can scientifically prove. Laws, data, observation.
So forget religion, forget abstract philosophy. Society should be studied like what? An organism in a lab.
Pretty much. He literally proposed sociology as this new empirical science. You study the social body, find its laws, optimize it for progress.
And someone who really ran with that idea but used it for social justice was W.E.B. Du Bois.
Oh, absolutely. Du Bois was critical of earlier sociologists just making broad generalizations, often based on, frankly, prejudice.
Armchair theorizing?
Exactly. He said, we need data. And he delivered with the Philadelphia Negro in 1899.
That was groundbreaking. Not just theory, but actual field work.
Intense field work. He and his team did something like 2,500 door-to-door interviews, collecting real numbers on literacy, jobs, income, crime rates.
Quantifiable stuff.
And that allowed him to produce the first really empirical, data-driven analysis of institutionalized racism in America.
It's foundational, isn't it? We take statistics for granted now in policy debates.
Completely. Crime rates, income averages. Du Bois showed how you could use that Enlightenment tool, objective data, to actually fight oppression. He measured the problem.
Okay, now let's shift gears dramatically. Because while people like Comte and Du Bois were trying to fix problems within the system, the Marxists came along and said, no, the whole system is the problem. Capitalism itself.
Right. This really starts with Hegel's influence, his dialectic method.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Yeah.
Ideas clashing and creating something new.
Exactly. History moving through conflict. Marx loved that idea of motion through conflict, but he flipped it. He grounded it in the material world.
Not ideas.
Marx gives us dialectical materialism. The conflict isn't between abstract concepts, it's between real-world economic forces.
So the class struggle.
That's the core of it. The owners, the bourgeoisie versus the workers, the proletariat. That economic tension, that's what drives history for Marx. It's material reality.
And what specifically fuels that engine? He talked about surplus value. Can you break that down?
It's actually pretty straightforward, conceptually. A worker creates a certain amount of value in a day. Let's call it X.
Okay.
But their wage only covers part of that value, say Y.
The cost of keeping them working.
Right. The difference, X minus Y, that's the surplus value. And the capitalist keeps that as profit.
And Marx saw that as inherently unfair.
As exploitation, pure and simple. That stolen value, the surplus, makes the capitalist class richer and more powerful, which allows them to exploit even more.
Vicious cycle.
And Marx believed this internal contradiction made a workers' revolution, a communist revolution, not just possible, but historically inevitable.
But the big historical sticking point is that he thought it would happen first in the most industrialized places, England, Germany.
And it didn't. Not like he predicted.
So Marxism had to evolve in the 20th century.
It absolutely did. Lenin, for instance, came up with his theory of imperialism.
How did that explain the delay?
Lenin argued that those advanced capitalist countries basically exported their exploitation. They used imperialism to extract surplus value from colonies in Africa, Asia, South America.
So they bought off their own workers, basically, with colonial profits.
Sort of. It eased the pressure at home. And it meant, for Lenin, that the revolutionary flashpoint would shift to those exploited nations, the colony.
Okay. And then Mao Zedong in China faced a different problem. Not enough industrial workers like Marx talked about.
Exactly. China was largely agrarian, so Mao had to adapt the theory again. He broadened the definition of the revolutionary class.
To include who?
Peasants, obviously, but also intellectuals, even parts of the national bourgeoisie who were against foreign imperialism. It made the theory much more flexible for places that weren't like industrial Europe.
The flexibility came with, well, methods of control. Mao's self-criticism. The sources paint a pretty dark picture of that.
Yeah. Theoretically, it was meant for collective improvement, helping comrades overcome bourgeois or reactionary thinking through group discussion.
But in practice, especially during the Cultural Revolution.
In practice, particularly from 1966 to 77, it became a tool of terror. It went from, maybe awkward group sessions to public humiliation, brutal denunciations, forced confessions, physical violence, even murder.
Targeting class enemies.
Often based on very little evidence, just political accusation and social pressure. It's a really stark reminder of how revolutionary ideals can morph into systems of oppression.
Yeah, a chilling example. Okay, let's pivot. Because while the Marxists were focused on economics, revolution, political power, other thinkers were questioning something even more fundamental.
Right. They were challenging the whole Enlightenment idea that knowledge or meaning itself could be objective or fixed.
We're moving into what's often called continental philosophy. First stop. Hermeneutics.
The study of interpretation. And it's tied up with this idea of historicity.
Meaning things only make sense in their historical context.
Essentially, yes. Meaning isn't just sitting there in the text or the event. It emerges through time, through how it's understood in different eras.
Can you give an example?
Paul Ricoeur, a major figure in hermeneutics, used literary examples. Think about reading, say, Dickens' Oliver Twist today versus in the 1840s.
Would see different things.
Exactly. We might pick up on, for instance, the anti-Semitic stereotypes around the character Fagin in a way Dickens himself or his original audience might not have fully processed. Our context highlights it differently.
So the meaning isn't just what the author intended.
Ricoeur argued meaning is fundamentally plural. The text, he said, only really says what we, the interpreters, make it say. Discourse conversation, reading, interpretation opens up endless possibilities. Fixed, objective meaning, that's rejected.
That is a huge shift from looking for universal laws. And then there's phenomenology, which takes this away from text and into just living.
Right. Phenomenology studies how we encounter the world through our direct first-person experience. Not through abstract concepts, but through lived reality.
Merleau-Ponty.
Yeah. They urged us to focus on how something appears to us in the moment, not its abstract essence. Think about a chair.
Okay.
Its meaning isn't some fixed definition. If you're using it right now as a step stool to change a light bulb, its meaning is step stool in that moment of experience.
Your interaction defines it.
And Merleau-Ponty really emphasized the body in this. We don't just perceive with our minds. We perceive through our physical, embodied engagement with the world. Our body structures how we see things.
So reality isn't some objective blueprint out there. It's shaped by how we physically engage with it.
And Heidegger pushed this even further with Dasein, which basically means being in the world.
Being has to happen somewhere.
Exactly. He argued that philosophical navel-gazing, abstract thought is actually less informative than everyday activities. Driving your car, hammering a nail. The truth is in the doing, in the lived experience, not just in thinking about it.
And all this focus on lived experience, on context, it kind of lays the groundwork for existentialism, right?
It does. If meaning isn't fixed, if structures are created through human experience, then humans have radical freedom and responsibility to shape those structures. Nothing is set in stone. Things can be changed.
Okay, that brings us into the 20th century and how these ideas got applied back to society. The Frankfurt School took these critiques about meaning and context,
Hermeneutics, phenomenology,
and aimed them squarely back at social change. This is the birth of critical theory.
Right. The Frankfurt School's main goal was liberation, freeing humanity from oppression. But they fundamentally broke with the Enlightenment's faith in pure reason. They argued that knowledge isn't just a collection of objective facts. Knowledge itself is shaped by power, by social structures. It's not neutral, it's embedded in the world it describes.
Can we make that more concrete? Walter Benjamin's idea of the messianic seems relevant here.
It's a fascinating concept. Benjamin saw the messianic not necessarily as a religious figure, but as a kind of conceptual break, a sudden interruption in the smooth, linear flow of history as told by the powerful.
Like hitting pause on the status quo.
Sort of. Imagine disrupting the accepted hierarchy of race or class, even just for a moment conceptually. It creates this flash where the oppressed might suddenly see their shared humanity outside the story that usually defines them. It opens up possibility.
And for creating more lasting change through dialogue, we have Jürgen Habermas.
Habermas focused on communication. He believed real emancipation happens through what he called communicative action.
People talking freely.
Basically, yeah, people debating ideas openly and rationally in a public sphere, whether that's old coffee houses or today's internet forums, ideally.
The process itself changes things.
He thought so. Intense, open debate sharpens arguments, exposes flaws, and can ultimately transform political systems. It allows people to create shared norms together, not just accept what's handed down.
Okay. But then we get to postmodernism and post-structuralism, which seem to take the critique even further. An outright rejection of universals.
Pretty much. Post-structuralism especially argues that meaning is constantly being created, constantly in flux. Any system that presents itself as universal capitalism, scientific laws, even ethical codes like Kant's is ultimately just a human story.
A construct.
A construct, yeah, a product of imagination, history, and crucially, power dynamics.
So how do you analyze these constructs? What are the tools?
Well, Jacques Derrida gave us deconstruction. It's a way of reading texts or systems to find the hidden assumptions, the internal contradictions.
How does it work?
It looks for why certain ideas got privileged over others. Like, historically, why was speech seen as more authentic than writing? Or reason valued over emotion? Derrida argued these hierarchies aren't natural, they're built in, and texts often undermine themselves, revealing these biases almost automatically. He called it auto-deconstruction.
And Nietzsche gave us a historical tool. Genealogy.
Right. Genealogy is like digging through the historical layers of our concepts, tracing things like good and evil back to their origins.
And finding they weren't so pure.
Finding they often originated in power struggles. Nietzsche famously argued that what the ancient noble ruling class called good, strong, healthy, powerful, was later redefined by the oppressed underclass into moral, good, humble, meek, forgiving, as a way to gain psychological power.
Wow. Okay. And Michel Foucault took these ideas about history and power.
And created perhaps the most influential critique. Foucault argued power isn't just something kings or governments have, it's a network. It's everywhere.
Like electricity in the walls.
Kind of. An invisible force that shapes everything, especially how knowledge is produced. Power creates what counts as truth, and that truth then reinforces power structures.
So genealogy becomes a tool against that.
Foucault saw genealogy as a weapon. By digging up the shameful origins, The messy, often violent, contingent beginnings of practices we think are normal or natural.
Like prisons or how we define mental illness.
Precisely. By showing they weren't inevitable, but constructed through power, you challenge their legitimacy today. You expose them as tools, not truths.
And a contemporary example applying these ideas is critical race theory, or CRT.
Right. CRT uses these tools to argue that whiteness isn't a biological reality, but a social invention, a construct.
That serves a function.
That functions to create and maintain systemic racism. CRT scholars argue racism isn't just individual prejudice, it's baked into legal systems, institutions, cultural norms, and they challenge the idea that anyone can be truly neutral when observing this.
Okay, so we've covered a huge amount of ground, from the Enlightenment's hope for objective data, like Du Bois used, and universal codes, like Kant sought.
Believing these would lead us steadily towards progress.
All the way to Foucault's idea of power as this invisible network shaping truth. And Ricoeur saying a text just means whatever the reader decides it means in their context.
It's a profound shift in how we think about knowledge and society.
It really is. And it leaves us with a pretty big question, maybe for you listening. The Enlightenment path seemed to rely on centuries of slow, careful reflection and data gathering to build a better moral code.
While the critical theorists argue that progress demands active, conscious struggle now, disrupting things, questioning power, constantly challenging the status quo through dialogue.
So what resonates more with you? Is that slow burn of objective discovery the necessary route? Or is liberation only possible through this constant critical deconstruction of the systems we inherit? Systems potentially riddled with hidden power.
It's a fundamental tension.
And maybe the sources point to something essential, regardless of which path you lean towards. Critical thinking itself. That willingness Paulo Freire talked about to question the very foundations, the things we take for granted.
That seems key to any form of emancipation, whether you're analyzing statistics or deconstructing narratives.
And one final thought to leave you with. Think about Comte's positivism, that radical idea that we should ditch all metaphysics, all religion, and focus only on provable scientific laws for society.
Compared with the post-structuralist view that any system claiming to be universal, any law, is ultimately just a human story, a construct held up by power.
Right. So if we fully embrace that post-structuralist critique, if we reject the very possibility of universal structures or objective laws, can we actually agree on any shared principles to guide human progress anymore? Where does that leave us?